الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين وبعد. The Prophet ﷺ, as we were informed by the wife of the Prophet Aisha رضي الله عنها, إذا دخل العشر أحيا الليل وأيقظ أهله وشد مئزره. The Prophet ﷺ, if the last 10 days of Ramadan entered upon him, he would pray the night, أحيا الليل, give life to the night through prayer, through dhikr, through dua, etc. And he would wake up his family, i.e. his wives, his children, and he would tighten his izar, his mi'zara, that which kept the lower garment above. He would tighten it, meaning ready for ibadah, ready for action, worship. And so as we have entered into these last 10 nights, we likewise have to try to utilize them to the best of our ability, as the Prophet ﷺ did as an example. And there are various ways in which we can try to utilize the last 10 days. The most important of which is ad-du'a and as-salah. To constantly make dua, to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to engage in salah during the night, qiyam, even if it's a small amount. Even if it's a small amount, to try to attain some of the virtue of the last 10 nights and the last 10 days of Ramadan. And this is a very important point. For many of us, sometimes we focus on the night and we lose focus on the day. No, the day is virtuous as well. And we should be utilizing the day of Ramadan, not just the night of Ramadan, the day of the last 10, not just the night of the last 10. Yes, the nights are virtuous, but the days also have their virtue. And so we should be trying to engage in recitation of the Quran, in dua, in dhikr, in salah, nafila, etc. And sometimes a person may feel that there's no point for me. Why? I've wasted what's come before the last 10 days. Some of us, we may have utilized the last few days of Ramadan, the last 20 days of Ramadan that have preceded these last 10. Others amongst us, some of us, we may be feeling, no, I've wasted them. I haven't used them. I've missed the opportunity. And so I don't feel the energy. I don't feel the point in worshipping during these last 10 days. No. Look at these last 10 days as if they are their own entity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His forgiveness and His acceptance and His mercy is unconditional. Allah Azza wa Jal His mercy is unconditional. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us the prime example of this, that which has been mentioned in some of the khutbahs previously. وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, if my servant asks about you, I am close. Asks you about me, I am close. I answer the call of the one who calls upon me when he calls, without condition. And of course, as was mentioned previously, this ayah is in between the ayat of siyam, which show that the fasting person's dua is answered. And we are in a time where dua is necessary. Ad-dua silahul mu'min. The dua, supplication, is the weapon of the believer. It strikes like an arrow. And so we should try our best to utilize this time to make dua for ourselves, for our families, for our ummah, both locally and globally, and of course for our brothers and sisters in Palestine, and for the liberation of Al-Quds. This should be something that we make dua for during these last 10 nights, and that itself is a great thing. If the entire ummah is making dua for the liberation of Al-Quds during the last 10 nights of Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is arhamur rahimin wa akramul akrimin. And just some examples of some du'as that we should try to make and that we should try to utilize. Try to find them if you don't have them. Allahumma ja'alni muqim as-salati wa min dhurriyyati. Oh Allah, make me from those who establish the prayer. Allahumma ja'alni muqim as-salah. Make me an establisher of the prayer. It's a sifa, it's a quality. Make me a person who has established, is establishing continuously. As-salah wa min dhurriyyati. And from my progeny. This is a dua that has to be made constantly. Utilize this time. And don't look to yourself and say, I am weak. I am weak. Don't imagine yourself not being able to fulfill something that you're making dua for. No. Rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you make dua. And likewise, رَبِّ هَبْ لِي مِنْ أَزْوَاجِي وَذُرِّيَّتِي قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنِي لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. A very powerful dua for the married and unmarried, for those who have children and those who do not have children. Oh Allah, grant me from my spouses and my children the coolness of my eyes, and make me an imam for the people of taqwa. And what does it mean to be an imam for the people of taqwa? It means that you yourself are a person of taqwa, and you are a role model. The people of taqwa have taken you as a role model, so you will have been adorned with the qualities and characteristics of taqwa. It's a very powerful dua. We should be utilizing it. Likewise, Allahumma alhimni rushdi wa qihi wajhi adab an-nar. Oh Allah, grant me my guidance. Allahumma alhibni rushdi. Oh Allah, grant me my guidance. Wa qini wajhi adab an-nar. And protect my face from the punishment of the fire. Another very important dua. And there are so many duas that we can find in the kalam of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And the best of du'as are the du'as of the Prophet ﷺ, because they are concise, precise, but profound in their meaning. Likewise, Allahumma aslih li dini wa dunyaya wa ahli wa mali. There are so many. This is the time to be making du'a. If you don't have the energy to pray, raise your hands and make du'a. Engage in dhikr. Recite the Quran. Use this time. Don't allow this time to fleet past us. No, utilize it. And don't look at yourself and say, Allah won't accept from me. Look at my sins. Who am I? I've wasted my time. No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His mercy is greater than any sin that can be committed on this earth. And His forgiveness is greater than any sin that can be committed on this earth. And so, utilize the time. And a second area that I would like to address this afternoon, which is not related necessarily to utilizing the last 10 days, but it should be a feature anyway. And I'm sure it's been spoken about at the masjid. But when we come out of the masajid, we are ambassadors of Islam. We are ambassadors of Islam, and this is a very important point. If you are a Muslim, whether you like it or not, you are a representative and an ambassador of Islam. People are going to look to you as a representation of Islam and what Islam means. Especially if you are dressing like a Muslim. If you are dressing like a Muslim and you are visibly Muslim, people are going to look at you and judge Islam based upon your actions. And so we have to be very careful in the way that we act. Sometimes you see a brother and he's wearing a thobe, has a beard, and he's smoking a cigarette outside the masjid, for example, or as he's walking to Taraweeh. And whether or not smoking, it's not about whether it's a major or minor sin. No, any sin is a misrepresentation of Islam. You have a Muslim sister wearing a hijab and abaya shouting across the street or using profane language. You're giving a bad example of Islam. You have, just now, as I was coming to the masjid, Allahul Musta'an, someone stopped their car in the middle of the road so that someone can come out and enter into the masjid. This is not correct. It's not correct because people are going to look at us as Muslims and say, look, they don't have any concern for others. No, we are ambassadors of Islam. Even if we don't agree with the system, we use the system. Why? Because we do not want to misrepresent Islam to others. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked about the munafiqeen, those whom he knew were munafiqeen, those whom he knew were hypocrites, they were not Muslims, and they had sold the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. He was asked about them, what should we do with them, Ya Rasulullah? And he said, leave them. Leave them. Why? Because I do not want it to be said that Muhammad harms his companions. ﷺ. Why? Because he was thinking about the representation of Islam to others. And so likewise for us, if I'm sitting on the bus, if I'm sitting on the train, I am an ambassador of Islam. If I litter, if I spit, even the way I look, sometimes we don't take care of our physical appearance. It's not correct as Muslims. It's not correct. You are an embodiment of Islam. And Islam, if you want to sell something that is precious to someone, what do? You wrap it up in the finest possible way. Likewise, Islam needs to be presented in the best of ways, and we are the ones who present Islam to others. And there are so many examples, alhamdulillah, here of brothers, their families come to Islam, sisters, their families come to Islam. Why? Because of their representation of Islam in their houses. And so we have to think about this in Ramadan and outside of the month of Ramadan. Outside of the month of Ramadan, year long. Because we do not want to be from those who put people off Islam. This is a big problem. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. The final point or theme to discuss this afternoon is, of course, what is happening in Palestine, in Gaza. And this is not something that we should be surprised by. We should not be surprised by this. In fact, it should show us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows His creation better than the creation knows itself. If we read the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clarified all things for us in the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described that which will take place on this earth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has categorized people into the categories that He knows them to be from. The problem is, when we read the Quran, we don't read it with an eye of application. We read it with, perhaps, as an act of worship, ta'abbudan, which, yes, it's an act of ibadah, but it should be an act of ibadah in our everyday lives, that which we apply. That which we apply. As was mentioned by Ibn Abbas, radiallahu ta'ala, that there will come a people, they will recite the Quran, and they will not make a single mistake in any of its letters, from the beginning until the end, but they have completely left off application of it in its entirety. Someone who has the tajweed, has the makharij, has the tartil, but he has no amal. Yet, Ibn Abbas, he said, you people, you make mistakes, but you have the amal. Talking about some of those who he was living amongst. And the most important aspect of the Quran is al-amal. And in order to have al-amal, you have to have understanding. And in order to have understanding, you have to have knowledge. And real knowledge is that which is applied. That which is applied, not that which is acquired. as a trophy and placed upon a tabletop. It's not a book on a shelf. It's not a book that has been memorized. No, it's that which is applied in our everyday life. If we were to apply the Quran, and this of course, it's a reminder to myself before anyone else. It's a reminder to myself before anyone else. If we were to apply the Quran as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended it to be applied, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today. We wouldn't. And there is one particular point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes over and over and over and over again throughout the Quran, which is the issue of this dunya. The issue of this dunya and the reality of this dunya. وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَهْوٌ وَلَعِبٌ وَإِنَّ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ لَهِيَ الْحَيَوَانِ. What is this life except play, except deceit, except moments of excitement? You take that away and this life is nothing. And the real life is the next life. The real life is the next life. And that's what we taste during this month of Ramadan. That's what we taste. Because we're focused on the akhirah. We're not focused on the dunya for 30 days. And so we start to taste something that we don't taste outside of this month. But we want to take that taste outside of this month. And so we have to start to plan. How can I continue that which I've started this month? And it's been said every other year, prior to this year, every Ramadan. How can I continue? How many Ramadans does a person have in their lifetime? Perhaps 30. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them a long life, perhaps 40. If Allah grants them a longer life, every Ramadan should be an improvement. And the main improvement should be detachment from this dunya. Detachment from this life. That is what inhibits us from applying the Quran as it should be applied. Attachment to this life. Love of wealth. Love of family. Love of possessions. Love of status. Love of fame. Love of comfort. And that's what has put us into this situation where we see our brothers and sisters being put to the slaughter and we stand helplessly and watch. Love of dunya, that's the reality. Love of dunya. A love for this life and a love for the pleasures of this life. Those of us who love the status and the power. Those of us who love the wealth. Those of us who love the comforts. But until we remove the dunya from our hearts collectively, we will continue to be in this position. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ informed us of in the hadith which was mentioned so many times. So many times. What did he say? When he said that the people will come to you as an ummah like they come to a table to consume together. And the Sahaba said, will we be small in number during those times, Ya Rasulullah? The Prophet ﷺ said, no. But you will have in your hearts al-wahn. حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَةُ الْمَوْتِ. Love of this life and the hatred for death. Love of this life and the hatred for death. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she asked in a different narration, she asked about hatred of death. She said, everyone doesn't like to die, i.e. the pain, etc. The Prophet ﷺ said, that's not what I'm referring to, but it's a want to meet Allah. And the one who hates death, it's because his heart is attached to this life. He has things here he doesn't want to leave behind. And that's the problem that we find ourselves in now. That's our issue. We're running after the dunya and we're shedding tears for our brothers and sisters. Yet we ourselves are a part of the problem. We ourselves are a part of the problem. Our consumption and running after the dunya is what is fueling what is taking place in the world today. The only difference between us and the Sahaba, application of the Quran. And every single generation that came after the Sahaba, they had the same quality. Those who Allah revived Islam with, they had the same quality of applying the Quran as it should be applied. That's the only difference. And so if we turn to the Quran as a manuscript to be applied, as a formula for success in this life, we will see it in our lives, individually and collectively. And so as we read the Quran this month, the end of this month I should say, and as we try to exert ourselves in worship, we also need to ask ourselves, how can I apply this Quran in my life outside of the month of Ramadan? What have I left off in Ramadan that I don't want to go back to outside of Ramadan? For some of us, they may be addictions. Beg Allah in the last 10 days. Beg Allah Azza wa Jal. Cry to Allah Azza wa Jal. And complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about the weakness of our state. And ask Allah, oh Allah, I can't leave this thing off. Aid me, grant me the ability, grant me strength. If it's laziness, beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for strength. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears. And Allah is akramul akrimeen. Allah is more generous than to turn away his slave who is asking him to guide him towards him. Allah is more generous than that. So no matter where we are in our lives, we can utilize these last 10 days by making dua, reflecting over what we've left off during this month, reflecting over our position in this dunya and our attachment to this dunya, and reflecting over what needs to change in order for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant victory to this ummah. And the victory of this ummah is not conditional based upon that which is happening outside of this ummah. The victory of our ummah is always based upon what happens internally, regardless what happens externally. And there are so many examples throughout our history. So many examples throughout our history. It's not about the strength or the ability or the might or the position of that which is external. It's about the state of that which is internal within our ummah. And the most important issue there, attachment to this life and disattachment to the next. It needs to change. And to conclude, as Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, a person who travels towards the dunya cannot travel towards the akhirah at the same time, just as a person who travels east cannot travel west at the same time. If you travel east, you cannot travel west. If you travel west, you cannot travel east. Likewise, you run towards the dunya, you cannot run towards the akhirah. You run towards the akhirah, you cannot run towards the dunya. You only have oneself, and it can only go in one direction. The closer we get to the akhirah, the further away we will depart from this dunya. The closer we get to this dunya, the further away we will find ourselves from the akhirah. And don't belittle the small acts. Don't belittle the small acts. Gains that compound, incremental, step by step. One unit of 2 rak'ah, one dua, one sitting of azkar, dhikr, one recitation of the Quran. It all adds up. It all adds up. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at the quantity. Allah Azza wa Jal looks at the quality. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that utilize these last 10 days and nights. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us and overlook our sins. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين. اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا إنك أنت العفو الكريم. اللهم وفقنا في هذه الأيام العشر يا رب العالمين وفي لياليها. اللهم انصر إخواننا في فلسطين وفي أنحاء العالم يا رب العالمين. اللهم ارفع راية الإسلام واجعلنا من الرافعين له. اللهم اجعلنا من الناصرين للدين يا مجيب الدعوات. اللهم استعملنا ولا تستبدلنا إنك مجيب الدعوات وأقم الصلاة.